it's more important to be involved than to not be involved. There's too much that we need to deal with in this world to not be involved.
It's not a library, it is people's voices, women's voices and histories.
What I would like for the Feminist Library and its future is safety, because it's an amazing resource and it's an important resource and it's a moment in history and it's vulnerable. It's really vulnerable.
Given that we are based in central London, this is becoming progressively harder under neoliberalism and under the housing crisis, and the fact that we are the tenants of Southwark Council who want to sell this building off for luxury flats.
In light of the recent sort of severe cuts to the council, they are trying to raise as much money as possible, and one way that they want to do this is by kind of leaning on the residents of this building to pay market rent.
The council's already agreed to 2-month extension to the deadline for them to sign a new lease.
What is not going to be possible and not desirable is for us to stay in this building while the building remains in its present condition, because it's very damp, it's very hot in summer, very cold in winter, not good for books and paper, not good for human beings.
We're very keen to find a solution
Yes,
to this. As you know, we love libraries in Southwark,
Yes.
and we've invested in libraries when others have closed
Yeah.
in other boroughs. So, you know, we're not anti-books, we're not anti-libraries, and we want to see the Feminist Library continue in our borough.
I'd like to invite a representative from the library to come forward to give me a position that's before I can agreed.
We called a demonstration outside the council's budget setting meeting on the 24th of February. We took the petition there and it was just under 15,000 signatures at that point.
Very much.
I've never noticed the weight on me that had been lifted by these women from history who had literally paved the way that I can live the life that I do now. And I felt really inspired first, and I felt taller and more vertical and kind of bigger in the world. And then I felt really, really upset and angry that my education had let me down, that I'd got to this point and no one had ever told me about these women.
Young women don't know anything about the women's liberation movement. So it's really hard to keep women's history alive. You know, it's just like when it's over, it's dead. It's like it never happened.
There's many women that don't know that the Feminist Library exists, for instance. They don't know that there's such a place.
You know, for the longest time, we've had a pretty rocky relationship with our premises. There was a couple of years where we were actually locked out with this building. And the doors were locked, and that was it. We couldn't get in.
And where were the books during that time?
They were here.
They were inside.
They were inside, just being not looked at.
I first came across the Feminist Library just about when it had moved to where it is now. I then went on with the work that I'd done in the library and at what used to be the Fawcett Library, and did my PhD in women's history. In 1990, when I registered, the sort of history I wanted to do, you really couldn't do in a history department. It was just considered so out of it. Whereas, of course, these days, every history department in the country has somebody like me teaching courses like that. But it's only because of places like the Feminist Library that we were able to get the whole thing going back in the 80s.
About 3 years ago, there was 5 years previous to that where the library was closed just because we didn't have enough volunteers to open it on a regular basis. But now in the last 3 years, we've kind of got to a point where we can have it open 4 out of 7 days. The next step is to turn it into something that's open all the time, 6 or 7 days a week.
It's absolutely essential for it to stay open, because otherwise you have a whole kind of history, or millions of kind of histories. There are over 7,000 books in that library, and that's just the books, let alone the kind of pamphlets and other documentation.
I went to the Feminist Library as part of my History of British Feminism module. Our tutor wanted to show us about the great activism that they do through sort of like archiving and collecting, and also I just really wanted to see the stacks of spare ribs everywhere.
This is the periodicals room. There's over 10,000 separate publications, I think. It's either 10 or 15,000. It is publications from all over the world. And it ranges from newsletters all the way through to properly published books. And then One of our other crowning glories is the almost full collection of spare rib that we've got.
All of us are actually exploiting the feminist library. I don't think any of us are not using it because of what you have. Yeah, you're one in a million.
Brilliant.
My first involvement with the Feminist Library was in 1973.
I did join the collective of what was the Feminist Library, which was then called the Women's Research and Resources Centre.
I was teaching in the London School of Economics, and I was part of a group of women who, in sociology, were very interested in what was happening.
The women's liberation movement in this country did get going in around about 1969, 68, 69. And it was a very vibrant and activist movement, and it grew very quickly.
We set up the Women's Research and Resources Centre because women were wanting to have information about the women's movement. There was really no place they could get that information.
I was very drawn to the idea of bringing together feminist scholarship. What was thought of as objective mainstream scholarship had been distorted by patriarchal thinking.
In teaching women's studies, I used to use this as an example. I would say, the only thing I knew was that some crazy women chained themselves to the Parliament fence. Do you know any more? And that opened it up so they could say, well, no, I don't know any more than that.
Sociology at that time was a very male-dominated professional part of academia. Most of the women who were working in academia had very insecure contracts. A lot of them who had managed to claw their way into junior academic posts, they were activists, and there was not, this is quite important to stress, that there was not this sharp division in the early days between academia and activism.
Feminist scholarship, as well as a great many other things, was about simply setting the record straight and restoring women back to the mainstream, which we are half of.
We've got the Feminist Library here in Southwark. We've got the Women's Library at LSE.
What's currently being offered at LSE is not the same material that's being offered at the Feminist Library.
I'm actually very proud of this. Women's Report was a really significant periodical.
These two libraries, which are, only about a 15 minutes walk away, are like two ends of a spectrum.
They put the Women's Library at LSE on the 4th floor, so you can't walk in off the street.
You have to go through a process, you have to call, you have to make an appointment, you need to have some form of ID. It's not a public library. The collection is definitely feminist, but the space isn't.
This is one about the Fawcett Society Library, which was in danger of being sold off and taken by the LSE. How ironic that nearly 40 years later, the Fawcett Library is what became the Women's Library, and it got captured by the LSE. Anyway,
people would come in, they'd use the library. There were a few chairs. If we run out of chairs, they'd sit on the floor. And then if anyone wanted to get out of the room, you'd have to climb over people. Because on some days it was just so popular. There were so many people wanting to come in and use the materials, which just weren't available anywhere else.
It's radical. It's it's political, and you can just feel that in the space.
We moved to the Hungerford House, and I think that was the point it became the Feminist Library, and it was a lending library, which was very important.
I would be putting a newsletter together, I'd be organising the events, I'd be taking the phone calls, which could be anything from, I'm doing research on the suffragettes, or I'm studying the history of women's rights for my O-levels, or I'm looking for where I can get an abortion, where can I go?
Everything in here is written for women, by women, to meet the needs of women in terms of their intellectual, their spiritual, their psychological, development, their economic development.
It is literally like this kind of humming bed of feminism, particularly second wave feminism. And I love bringing school groups in here so they can kind of smell the magazines and really get that sense of the second wave. We look at the adverts, we think what were those, what did the people that were writing this, what were they saying, what were they angry about, what were they talking about. We go to loads of events, we have events here. I think that's my highlight of being at the Feminist Library, is the events.
We organised a programme of lectures and papers and talks from feminist scholars who were investigating the ways in which patriarchal scholarship had eliminated women from so-called mainstream knowledge.
When we're taking a book off the shelf, for instance, it's not just a book. We're holding knowledge that's born out of the real intricacies and difficulties, the joys and the pains and the sorrows and the struggles of women.
There's a text called Why There Been No Great Women Artists by Linda Nochlin, and in it she argues there are no female equivalents of the great male artists, the genius artists. There are no Davids, there are no Da Vincis, there aren't the equivalents, there aren't. And she said any feminist who goes along and she said falls for the bait, hook, line and sinker, and it's like, oh look, I found this this obscure flower painter in 19th century France. She said that's a fool's game basically, because what you're saying then is that we should that these women achieved because they worked really, really hard, and all of the rest of the women that were there, they just didn't work so hard. If they'd have tried really hard, they would have been kind of celebrated as well. And actually the reason there are no equivalents of these male artists isn't because the women couldn't achieve the greatness, it was because the society would not allow them to grow in that way. Women weren't allowed in the life drawing sessions, so they couldn't draw the male nude. To be a master, you had to draw the male nude. Women couldn't get in classes. It's as simple, you can't do it, you couldn't achieve it.
This was the news letter for May to June 1976. I think I typed it all myself actually on a stencil.
I think we really do need to know that we've done things, that we've done a hell of a lot.
Friday the 4th of June, Gwen Aubrey from the Welsh Folk Museum, Sex Roles in Sexism and Language.
We've always been active agents in terms of our own lives and the support that we can give to each other, but just the support that we give to the world generally. You know, we keep things going.
Friday, April 23rd, Feminism in Israel, Natalie Rain.
I would always go to my local library and look in the women's section, because you had the women's section and it was very well stocked with feminist books, black feminist books particularly.
A book that was in fact not published until the 90s, which was called Portraits to the Wall, which was a book of essays about lesbian history, and Queen Anne is one of the women that is featured in it. That book was written 20 years ago. That is not long ago, but I wonder how many feminists, lesbians, whatever, know that that book exists.
When I did my first class, I asked them to choose a person that most inspired them and they wanted to go ahead and research more. I included Rosa Parks, Rosalind Franklin, and there was one other big one, Emmeline Pankhurst, and no one wanted to be them. I had no one that chose those women. I had 5 Sylvia Riveras, I had 3 Mary Wollstonecrafts, I had like 4 Claudia Joneses. The people wanted a new history, they were hungry for it. And I think it's important to recognise the history that we do learn, recognise the canon, and then just hack at it. And I think that's all we can do, and I think it's important to do that.
Friday, May the 23rd, Janet Spedding from Ensley College of Education, Hull, The Clergyman's Wife, a case study in the sociology of conformity.
I remember, borrowing, Heart of the Race, which is about, black women in the UK context.
June the 8th, a male speaker this time, Angus MacLaren, Abortion in England, 1890 to 1914.
That's when I encountered Alice Walker's work for the first time, and Audre Lorde and Maya Angelou particularly.
In the non-fiction room once, we had a book on sex work. It was filed or catalogued under Violence Against Women, and one of our volunteers moved it to Women's Work. And another one of our volunteers moved it back under Violence Against Women, and this book just moved around in the feminist library.
In typical library cataloguing systems, women get a women's section. There's no feminism, there's no specifics within the catalogue. It's just women.
I think people always imagine libraries and cataloging systems and archival systems to be really objective and neutral, because you think it's an archival system. What's political about it? But there's so much politics that goes into the classification of information.
It's really important that that book could move around, and that people can try on different versions of themselves and their feminisms, and that we can learn who we are through speaking to each other.
A book is never just about one thing, A book always has a lot of themes in it, and when you decide to classify it under one category, you're saying this theme of the book is more important than the other theme, and that's a subjective decision.
One of our very early volunteers, a lady named Wendy Davis, set this up for us, and this is basically, if you were going to have a catalogue here, it would be women, and then all of this lot falls under it.
In fiction, for example, it has, it's classified according to author, last name of author, which is, pretty standard. But then it has those dots to highlight books that are usually underrepresented. So, there's a color code for like LGBT fiction, or a color code for fiction written by women of color. If it's a book about politics, it would just be politics. If it's a book about male politicians. If it's a book about women in politics, it'll be a subcategory of politics within classification systems. And then if it's, black women, then it'll be a further subcategory.
Women do have some shared interests, but we have conflicts as well, and it's naive to think that we're all going to be on the same side.
The Black British feminist voice is still struggling to come through in some ways. So in terms of, mainstream media representations of Black feminists, I think the tendency is to look over the ocean and to look at what's happening in the US.
The Feminism in Israel event was attended by some women from a Palestinian group who were angry that an Israeli speaker had been allowed to speak at this event. I sort of escorted them protesting down the stairs, and just as we got to the front door, one of them hit me on the side of my head so that my head bashed against the wall.
But we've got homegrown Black feminists. I just think, where are we? We're not being seen, and we're not necessarily being heard in the way that we need to be seen and heard.
Of course, in retrospect, I understand their point. I understand why Palestinians would be angry against the Israelis who have colonized their country. But at the time, I think I thought that the feminist link, the fact that we were all women together, the fact that we were all feminists, would at least allow a meeting to take place.
I could just say, oh, well, it's to do with racism. I could say it's to do with racism within, the feminist movement in this country, and that would be an aspect of it.
I wasn't familiar then with the term intersectionality. That was to come much later. But yes, the realization that actually it isn't enough to say we're all women together, all women are the same.
We definitely don't all agree. We definitely have our differences, but we are all feminists together in this space.
It's part of my task to make the library available to as many women as possible.
It's a space that doesn't say, oh, this is what we do, so come to it. It says, this is your space. You can come here and use it as you want.
All women need to have access to the resources here. Every woman needs to feel that this is a home of sorts, a spiritual home.
One of the things that I'm most inspired by from the women's liberation movement is their collectivity, their direct action en masse together. And that is what I want this movement of feminism, contemporary feminism, to draw from.
I was at the younger end of the women's liberation movement when I got involved, so I'm still relatively young, but we are dying off. Quite a few of us have died in the last few years, and this is only going to increase. So it's quite important to collect our histories and provide some continuity while we're still here.
Consciousness-raising groups were born in the women's liberation movement, where groups of women would come together confidentially and share and talk about their experiences, about different topics, about their lives. It was this deep moment of sharing and of feeling somebody in a space.
That was a really important process for many women, because one knew things weren't right, but you couldn't exactly explain what's wrong.
In the 1970s, 80s and 90s, there was an awful lot of women's history work done. And in fact, our biggest section here is probably women's history. There are articles about consciousness raising groups. There are articles about the small group process. I think a lot of that work is really in danger of being lost, in the sense of acquainting with younger women with that history, which is like really important to them for informing their activism.
We need to pull together more, we need to feel more as one, and we need to share rather than just kind of combat at each other. We should share in terms of like these consciousness raising groups. And I was really inspired by Sisters Uncut, who did that piece of direct action at the Suffragette premiere, and that reminded me of the women's liberation movement. When I saw the picture of them laying on the red carpet together, strong, I felt excited by that link, and I think that's the way that we should go.
Why feminism?
Why not feminism? At university, you unless you sort of shy away from it, you sort of realise that it needs to be part of your life. You need to do something about it, otherwise there's just this like lad culture and, you know, girls just having to put up with stuff which isn't right. There's definitely a need for it now, and I think in celebrity culture as well, it's becoming kind of like this thing, but I don't know if that's sort of filtering down into like actual everyday to-day life.
We've come so far, you know, the second wave got us so much and such a massive leap, but actually there's a lot more to do.
There's a way in which things have not changed very much, really, for women. And one could start with jobs, you know, the pay that women receive, the conditions under which women work.
We don't have an equal society at all.
I remember seeing this campaign leaflet, which was about 7 demands of the women's liberation movement. And I remember looking at it and thinking, none of them have been achieved yet. And this is, you know, it's more than 40 years later.
There are other issues as well that are really common issues for women, their relationships, if they have children, and so on.
How we use language, as we know, is hugely important. And if you have a language in which, for example, the word man is sometimes used to mean everybody, and sometimes used to mean only half of everybody, and it is used interchangeably, and you're expected to guess whether you or I as women are included or not, that's pretty serious political stuff, because we don't know whether we don't even know whether we're being excluded.
There's been no real reduction in violence against women, both physical violence in relationships and in marriage, or sexual violence, or child sexual exploitation.
Some things haven't changed, or, you know, we're still having the same arguments, we're still fighting the same fight.
You name any type of violence against women, and it hasn't altered. What has happened is a greater understanding of these different forms of violence against women and children, girls.
It has been hard being a feminist recently, in some ways, because a lot of people are focusing on our differences as a feminist movement.
Despite the differences, you know, we're all women, and we've all got something to say to each other, and, you know, this space will, you know, I'm hoping will facilitate some deep communication on a woman-to-woman level.
We have to really be careful of a kind of insidious misogyny that's coming back through again over the years, that is hiding within a kind of like a discourse of property and getting the communities out to put private companies in under this idea of it's just market value, we're just doing business.
The Feminist Library has been threatened with eviction and kind of had been in peril at different points throughout its history. And the building that we are currently housed in is 5 Westminster Bridge Road. It's actually owned by Southwark Council, but it was given to the council by the GLC, the Greater London Council, when it was disbanded in the sort of mid to late 1980s. So this building was set up to house various different organisations, community and voluntary organisations, that were engaged in anti-racist activity at that time. So the library was kind of selected and approved to kind of join the different groups that were here. So the GLC left a covenant that it had to be kept for that purpose for 25 years, but now we're in the situation where that's now expired, so it's up to the council to decide what this building should be used for.
I read that 5 libraries are being axed throughout the borough in favour of gyms for private members. And I just think, well, our future generation will have great bodies and be able to look at, if they have the salaries, amazing views, and have actually no cultural context, identity or history.
We signed a tenancy at will, which meant that we were allowed to stay on the service charge only rate that we were paying, so it's £12,000 a year in service charges to the council that we were paying. But the tenancy, it meant we effectively signed away all our rights. We got the message on the 23rd of December 2015, so 2 days before Christmas, that we were going to have that rent raised to £30,000, so 12,000 service charge and an extra £18,000 on top. And if we weren't in agreement to pay that by the 1st of March, then they would evict us.
We are standing up and saying, you know, this is ridiculous, we're not standing for it.
What they didn't realise, I don't think, is that March is Women's History Month, so it was kind of ironic.
Go and visit your women's library. Support them in whatever way you can. So if you're not able to go there physically, then visit virtually. If you've got the money, if you've got money available, then donate money. If there are events being put on, attend the events. If there are things that you want to see happen at your local feminist archive or library, you know, make some suggestions about what you want to see. Help to create libraries that meet your needs.
We were getting messages of support from kind of women's libraries and archives in places like Scandinavia, Italy, academics in America. We were getting messages of support on Twitter from Margaret Atwood, who was really supporting us. Mary Beard tweeted about it, and Sarah Waters and Gloria Steinem.
I believe that sisterhood should be a really open thing and that feminism is for everybody.
We want engagement to be both ways, because this is your library, this is your heritage. The women's consciousness as it's represented here is part of your consciousness. There is no separation. You know, this is about all of us.